Coast Guard, and I served in Vietnam.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Where were you living at the time?
Rockville, Connecticut.
Why did you enlist?
Well, the war in Vietnam was going on, and was looking not to be drafted, was looking to serve my country, and thought that the Coast Guard would probably be a good way to do that.
Why did you choose the Coast Guard?
Thought that my best chances of not going to Vietnam would probably be in the Coast Guard.
Did that turn out to be true?
No, it wasn't. That was the first place that I served.
Do you recall your first days in service? Where was your induction, and then where'd you go?
Well, I was signed up in Hartford, Connecticut. My dad brought me in. I had dropped out of high school, and having to do something with my life, my dad said, well, you're not going to sit around and not do anything, so think about joining the service, which I did, and like I said, I decided to join the Coast Guard. I had some friends that were also in the Coast Guard, and some were in boot camp, so I said, you know, to go there, at least I may know somebody or make it a little bit easier for me to do that.
Where did you go after your induction in Hartford?
Well, I went off to boot camp at Cape May, New Jersey, and that's where the Coast Guard boot camp was at that time on the East Coast. They also had a West Coast boot camp, and that was in Alameda, California. I don't believe they have that anymore, but they still have a boot camp in Cape May.
How long was boot camp?
Coast Guard boot camp at that time was 8 weeks.
And what kind of things did they train you?
We were trained in, we learned Coast Guard history, of course. We were trained in various weapons, the 45 sidearm, M16 rifle. We carried the M1 Garand. That was the rifle that we carried in boot camp. Although that was pretty much phased out, but that was still kind of more traditionally the weapon that we trained with and stuff like that.
Do you remember the date that you enlisted?
That was July 14th, 1969.
What was your boot camp experience like?
Pretty scary right up front. When you first got there, they kind of made it a point that they were in charge and you would do what they told you to do. I think that was kind of to scare everybody into doing what you're told. But that kind of mellowed out a little bit as you became more familiar with your surroundings and started attending your classes and got to know the different men that you were serving with and kind of the lay of the land down there. So I don't want to say that it was enjoyable, but looking back on it, I think it was very rewarding and ultimately made a man out of me, pretty much.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
My drill instructor was a Chief Kirshner. I think he was a quartermaster chief.
What was he like?
Very demanding. But that earned respect, and at the end, during graduation day, I think most of us had tears in our eyes.
So you had a formal graduation from boot camp?
Yes.
And did your family come down for that?
Yeah, my mom and dad came down, and actually they came down a couple times while I was in boot camp for weekend visits.
Where did you go after boot camp?
I was assigned to Base Boston, Coast Guard base, awaiting orders for whatever they were going to do with me. I had requested a school. I had requested Cooks and Bakers School, but because the classes were filled, they shipped me off to Boston for a temporary duty.
What was your temporary duty?
After 2-3 days, I was finally assigned to the cutter chase that was based in Boston. But she was on her way to Vietnam, but she was at the Coast Guard Yard in Baltimore, Maryland. During combat training down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, they had experienced some engine trouble, so they had to go back to the Coast Guard Yard for repairs. And I think at that point the captain decided that he needed a few more sailors on his boat, so had requested some sailors, if available, out of Boston. So me and another fellow were waiting orders up there, and we were the two. So they put us on a plane and flew us down to Baltimore, and that's where I was formally assigned to the Coast Guard cutter chase out of Boston.
Now, at that time, did you have any kind of specialized training, or were you just considered a sailor?
I was a seaman apprentice, no formal training at all.
So what do they expect seaman apprentices to do?
Well, being low guys on the totem pole, so to speak, we were the guys that did the cleaning, the painting, light maintenance, and things like that. Cleaning the ship in the morning and doing basically whatever needed to be done.
Can you tell me anything about the cutter chase? Any statistics on that? What it was, how big it was, how many men it held?
The cutter chase was, at that time, it was one of the brand new Coast Guard cutters. I believe she was commissioned in 1968, or late 1967, 1968. She was 378 feet long. She was, her main propulsion was 2 Pratt & Whitney jet engines with 2 auxiliary diesels. She would steam along at approximately 30 knots with both turbines online. She was almost kind of a test bed for the Navy. Back at that time, the Coast Guard cutters, this class of cutter, was the first ones to have jet turbine power. They had some stealth technology. They were the first ships to have steel hulls with aluminum superstructures. Their interior space was all air conditioned. They were the first ships to have flight decks that could take on helicopters would land on them. Very state-of-the-art, although the armament, the main armament, a 5-inch 38 caliber rifle, was World War II vintage, so it was kind of a mix of a couple of things there. But when I first saw the chase down in Baltimore, it was just, I couldn't believe that the Coast Guard had anything like that. It was pretty overwhelming to see it.
Now, when you were flown down to Baltimore, did you know you were going to be headed to Vietnam?
I found out the day before, me and the other fellow that had gotten out of boot camp and went to Boston. We were there for 2-3 days. We were wondering, well, what are they going to do with us? So I think that evening we went into the quartermaster shack and we're wondering, you know, what are you guys going to do with us? And they says, well, we don't have any assignments for you as of today. Well, the next morning they called us both in and they says, well, you've been assigned to the cutter chase. She's on her way to Vietnam, and we have plane tickets for you here. We're going to bring you over to Baltimore and fly you down there. So this all happened so quickly that I didn't even have time to call my parents. I called them from the airport in Baltimore, telling them what had happened, and that in 2-3 days I was going to be leaving for Vietnam. So that was quite a shock to everybody. I really didn't have a chance to say goodbye to my friends and family, other than the fact that my parents did drive down to Baltimore to see me off.
They did before you left? They got down there? Yeah,
my dad told me on the phone, he says, when you get to the ship, explain to the captain, you know, that this all happened so fast that if he would give you the day off that we get there, and you'd be able to spend that last day with us, which he did. So that was pretty cool, because I really knew nobody on the ship, and I had to go ask the captain or his representative if I could take the day off. So that was pretty good that they let me do that.
What was your trip like then, Baltimore over to Vietnam?
Well, I think we left on September 20, maybe the 27th.
What year is this now?
This was 1969, which was just a couple days after my 18th birthday. The first thing we did is we stopped in Virginia at an ammo dump there and picked up some ammunition for the 5-inch gun. Then we went through the Panama Canal, which was quite an experience, especially for a young sailor that just turned 18 years old. After we left the canal, we headed for Hawaii. But en route to Hawaii, we encountered a hurricane and got into some pretty rough weather. Again, quite an experience for a young sailor.
Were you seasick?
Yes, I did get seasick.
So what was the hurricane like? That must have been pretty scary.
That was pretty intense. Actually, we lost some of the antennas. Were actually ripped right off the ship. Some minor damage. But that only lasted a couple of days. Of course, the captain didn't want to go right through the hurricane. He tried to skirt around it as best he could. So.
Now, had you had any previous training with boating or out on the ocean?
No, not at all.
So this was your welcome to the sea. And then you landed in Hawaii. Did you stay there for any length of time?
Yes, we got to Hawaii and were there for, I think it was 5 days. They granted liberty, and we were allowed to go in to see Honolulu and Waikiki and tour Pearl Harbor and that whole area. And again, a young sailor, quite overwhelming to be so far away.
Now, what was your job while you were on the ship going over to Vietnam? Did you have a job?
Like I said, a seaman apprentice pretty much was, we were responsible to clean the ship in the morning. Usually we would start outside and rinse all the salt off from the previous day. And then we would go inside and clean all the compartments and wash out the heads, which is the bathrooms, and mop all the decks and kind of straighten up and make the ship presentable. And then the captain would come around with his people and make sure that everything looked good and was satisfactory. And that's basically what we did. And then in the afternoons or later on in the mornings rather, we would go and work with the bosun mates and stuff like that, and chip paint and repaint and repair, do whatever maintenance needed to be done on the ship and things like that.
Where did you go from Hawaii?
Let's see. After we left Hawaii, I think we made one fuel stop in Guam. I believe we stopped for fuel in Wake Island, and then we went to the Philippines, Subic Bay in the Philippines, which was a big U.S. Navy base there, and that was basically our home port during our Vietnam cruise. That's where we would go for our maintenance and our upkeep and things like that.
So, how long did you stay at Subic Bay?
I think we were in Subic initially for probably about almost a week, maybe.
And then where did you go?
From Subic Bay, we went on our first patrol off the coast of South Vietnam. We were during our time in Subic Bay, we became part of Coast Guard Squadron 3, which was the Coast Guard had 2 squadrons in Vietnam. Had Coast Guard Squadron 1, which was 26 82-foot patrol boats, and Coast Guard Squadron 3, which was 30 high-endurance cutters. They would usually, the Coast Guard Squadron 3, the cutters were deployed usually 5 at a time and serve for approximately 10 months, and then they would be replaced by another cutter. So during the whole course of the war, 30, we call them big white ones, like the big cutter that I was on, served during the course of the war. But usually there were different deployments. The cutter chase was in the 5th deployment of cutters. I believe there were 8 separate deployments.
Now, you were with 5 other ships when you were deployed?
Yeah, there were 5 other big white cutters, the big cutters that were there.
And then when they sent you out, you didn't stay off the coast of South Vietnam for 10 straight months, did you?
No, the patrols were approximately 30 days. Then you would
go out and patrol and then go back to Subic Bay?
Either back to Subic or you would go to a Liberty port. The Liberty ports that we went to were Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Bangkok. We were scheduled to go to Australia, but that didn't materialize because of, I think we had to do a double patrol because one of the cutters broke down. So we missed out on that opportunity, but got to see quite a bit.
So what was your first patrol like? Do you know exactly where you were off of South Vietnam?
I believe there were 4 or 5 patrol areas. I'm not sure where our first one was. I think it was up near the DMZ. During the whole course of my particular tour there, at one time or another, I was off the coast of Vietnam, South Vietnam, just about everywhere within those patrol areas. So, from the DMZ all around to the Cambodian border, actually, during our 10 months.
What would you do on patrol?
Our primary function was to stop the flow of men and materials from the north to the south. So we did a lot of stopping the junks and doing inspections, checking paperwork. The North Vietnamese would bring most of their men and materials down to resupply the south. The other means that they had was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but obviously it was much more easy to load stuff on boats and bring it down and deliver it. So our primary mission was to stop that. Our secondary mission was naval gunfire with our 5-inch gun. The cutter chase that I was on participated in, I believe it's 24 naval gunfire missions.
Can you remember any of those?
Usually what we would do is we would, of course being a seaman, I was not really privy to the intelligence at that point, so I was, part of the jobs that I did during naval gunfire was I worked in the magazines, sending the shells up to the gun and things like that. Pretty much we would go in and anchor where we were to shoot from, and then we would begin the gunfire. There would either be day shoots or night shoots, and we usually shoot probably an average of between 100 and 300 rounds in support of ground forces, or actually and sometimes we'd be firing on sensors that would be set up in a particular area. The sensors would pick up troop movements or something like that, the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, and we would be shooting on those sensors. So depending upon the intelligence that was coming in, we would get a mission and then go in and shoot.
Now, your primary mission, which was to stop the flow of men and material, what kinds of things did you do? Did you have to be pretty close to the shore to stop those little boats?
Yeah, the name of the operation was Operation Market Time, and it was called that because of all the ships and small junks and sampans that were used in bringing all the goods to market. Also, they could bring men and materials on those ships. So like I said, it was our primary function was to stop as many as we could and inspect them, check their paperwork. Of course, there was thousands and thousands and thousands of these boats, so it was quite a task that we had. But the Coast Guard Squadron 1, which was the 82-foot patrol boats, they were part of this as well. It was almost like a layered type thing. Our big ships were like 3 miles to 10 miles offshore, and the Coast Guard 81-footers were from the 3-mile to right in the coastline, and they were kind of doing the same things that we were. Basically looking for the big trawlers that would come down, usually at night, and they would be full of all kinds of arms and equipment and stuff like that, and then they would either offload to some of the smaller junks and sampans, and they would go into where they were dropping it off. Or the actual trawlers, if they could sneak in there, they would actually go in there and dock and offload their stuff to North Vietnamese or Viet Cong controlled areas.
Now, what would you do if you found either men or materials on board of one of their little boats?
Well, first there would be a suspected trawler. They would all the big ships and stuff like that. They would follow these and plot their courses and speeds, and that's part of the things that we would do. And if we saw the one that was suspected of changing course or heading inland, we would try to intercept them, maybe even call some other cutters in, call the 82-footers in. But in many cases, they would make a run for it. They would try to get in or try to evade us. And at that point, we would challenge them, and there may even have been some gun battles and things like that. Some of the trawlers were stopped and blown up right out at sea because they were full of armaments and things like that. So the Coast Guard was involved in most of all the major trawler engagements. I can't tell you exactly how many there were, but there were quite a few that were caught and destroyed.
Now, I know off camera you had told me a little bit about the history of the Coast Guard in the Vietnam War. Maybe now would be a good time. Can you just give me a quick rundown of what the involvement of the Coast Guard was in the Vietnam War?
Well, back in 1965, the war had kind of gotten underway, but they decided that they really needed to get a grip on how the supply lines were being handled from the north to the south, and they decided that they really needed to set up a barrier and surveillance to stop this flow. Well, the Navy really didn't have any shallow patrol boat type craft to use for that, and the Coast Guard, when the President determines that it's necessary, can actually make the Coast Guard part of the Navy. So the Coast Guard was contacted to see if they had any available patrol boats, which they did. They had the 82-footers. So the President requested that 26 82-footers be sent to work with the Navy and start this Operation Market Time Barrier Patrol. That was pretty successful, and actually they found that there was quite a bit of men and materials being brought down that way, so they requested that some of the Coast Guard's high-endurance cutters, which are not quite as big as a destroyer, pretty much most of them were destroyer escort class, but still they had the shallow draft that they could patrol offshore, so the Coast Guard was able to free up some of their cutters, and that's how the Coast Guard really was brought into the Vietnam theater.
Now, were you actually under Navy command?
Yes, the Coast Guard was under operational control of the Navy.
So, how long were you actually stationed overseas?
The Coast Guard tours for Squadron 3 was approximately 10 months from port to port.
So during that 10 months, how many patrols would you say you've gone out on?
Let's see, I think we did... I want to say 7, but it could have been 8.
Approximately, just so that we get an idea. And those patrols would be typically 30 days?
Yes.
Were there any casualties in your unit?
On my particular ship, we didn't have any casualties. During the course of the war, there were 7 Coast Guardsmen killed and 53 wounded.
Do you have any memorable experiences from those patrols you went on? What time period would this have been?
As
1969?
Oh yeah, it was. Our first patrol was in December 1969, and our last patrol was in May of 1970.
Now, during that period, did you have any memories of any patrols that you were on?
Well, what I remember most is that we were very, very busy. There was very little downtime. We were constantly stopping and inspecting junks and sampans. When we'd find somebody that would have something that was a major event, we'd have to, of course, literally capture these people, and then usually the 82-footers or some of the Navy swift boats and things like that would come in and take over at that point, and take the captives and bring them in and interrogate them or do whatever they were going to do.
So now, did your job change while you were on patrol? Or were you still the lowly seaman that had to do the cleaning and...
Yeah, I was still the what we call a seaman apprentice, fresh out of boot camp. But during that time, you order your seaman's course, and during my off hours, I would study my seaman's course and try to make seaman, and that would give me another stripe and give me more money too. So
when did you make seaman?
Made seaman during the tour, probably after about 6 months.
Now, was this like a home study course, so you just studied it on your own time and then took a test?
Yeah, home study course, pretty much. There's no going to any schools or anything.
No instructors or classroom?
No, and then you would take a written test.
So you were made seaman. Did that change your job duty at all?
Not really. Because I was
You were still the lowest guy on ship.
still on the same ship and still the lowest guy, because a lot of the seaman apprentice, most of us were taking the course and we got our stripe, but still the ship had to be cleaned and painted and stuff like that, so really didn't get much more respect.
Now, on your time in between patrols, typically how long would you have in between patrols?
Approximately a week. We would either go to a Liberty port and then go ashore and take tours or whatever, or go to Subic Bay for maintenance, repair, stuff like that. On one of our patrols, we blew one of our turbines and had to go back to Subic Bay and have that turbine replaced, so it was things like that. Go back to Subic Bay for maintenance.
Now, in that week in between, were you free to come and go as you pleased, or did you have duties that you had to take care of?
Again, it was shipboard maintenance, but we would usually get granted liberty every day, and we're able to go into town and do what sailors do.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
Well, in boot camp, we received the National Defense Service Medal, which is given out to all service people during times of war. In Vietnam, I received the Vietnam Service Medal, the Vietnam Campaign Medal, Vietnam Cross of Gallantry Unit Citation, Vietnam Civic Action Unit Citation, received the Sea Service Ribbon, which is 6 months or more of shipboard duty. We also received the Navy Meritorious Unit Commendation, which is a Navy award. And that's kind of something that you get being compared to other units, that if you did well, you would receive that. Most of the Coast Guard cutters received that award because we did do good. And the Combat Action Ribbon.
Did your tour in Vietnam include anything other than your patrols, and your leave in between patrols?
We would participate in the medical civic aid program. They were called MedCaps, where our ship's doctor and some men from the ship would go into villages and give medical help. We also had corpsmen on board, which are medical personnel. So we would go into the villages and give the kids shots and stuff, or anybody that needed to be looked at that wasn't feeling well or had injuries. We would do what we could for them.
Now, did you actually go on shore on these details when the MedCaps would go?
Yeah, usually some of the petty officers and then some of the seamen would go in at different times. So
what did you have, one doctor?
We had one main doctor that was, he was kind of drafted and served on our ship, and then our corpsmen, which were Coast Guardsmen. Those were the medical people, and then...
How many corpsmen did you have?
I believe we had 3 on our ship. And then at different times, the men would go into shore, into the villages, and I think the captain tried to make sure that everybody had a chance to participate in that. So at one time or another, we all went on a MedCap. Of course, the Dr. Brown, went every time. It's kind of funny. They just did a documentary on the Coast Guard in Vietnam on the military channel, the Discovery Channel's military channel, and my skipper, Captain Caldwell, was interviewed, and he was talking about Doc Brown. He says that when we got there and did our first MedCap, he told Doc Brown, he says, listen, you you have to go in and go into this village and help the people there. And Doc Brown didn't want to do that. He says, that's not why I came over here. I don't want to go into Vietnam. I came over here to serve on the ship. And Captain Caldwell says, well, you have to go. This is part of your mission, and you don't want to say no to me. So the captain says, he says, after Doc Brown went and did his first MedCap, he says, I couldn't keep him on the boat. He wanted to go and do a MedCap every day. So it turned out to be something very rewarding, given the chance to see exactly what we did there. And that's something that the Coast Guard is very proud of. All the work we did with the civilians and trying to help the Vietnamese people.
Do you recall what the MedCap you went on was like?
Kind of scary. I think the majority of the time we spent with the kids. We all brought chocolate bars and candy and stuff with us, and handed that out to the kiddos. And some of the fellows had Polaroid cameras, and of course the kids never saw anything like that, and they got a big kick out of that. So tried to make it as an enjoyable experience for us and for them as we could. Like I said, we're very proud of that part of our mission.
Now, what did you do on your liberties? I know you saw a lot of different countries. What different places did you get to see?
Well, usually we would try to go on some kind of a tour, like in Singapore and Hong Kong. They both had a place called the Tiger Balm Gardens, and they were kind of oriental gardens with all kinds of flowers and plants, and they had like little scenes and pagodas and different things of their history, and quite different than our culture. Seeing all the different things like that, and of course Hong Kong and Singapore, those were major cities, and did a lot of shopping, and everybody always wanted to bring something back for your mom or your dad or your wife and kids and stuff. So lots of shopping, and of course the nightlife. Big part of a sailor's life is going out and having some fun.
Where else did you go besides Singapore and Hong Kong?
We went to Bangkok, Thailand. Actually, we steamed up a river and anchored in this river, and the boats would come out, and water taxis, I guess you call them, would come out and take us into where we could get cabs that would bring us into town. We went to Taiwan. Went to the city of Kaohsiung.
Can you spell that?
I don't think so. It starts with a K, but.
And where was that?
That was in Taiwan, which I think is the island of Formosa.
Do you have any memorable experiences from the times you were on Liberty?
Again, being a young sailor, it was pretty overwhelming to be so far away from home and seeing the different cultures, and having a chance to visit foreign lands. It was just a real eye-opener for a young guy.
Had you previously ever been out of Connecticut even?
No, I hadn't been to the West Coast, and just went on vacation with my family and stuff. Had been to Florida and had been around New England, stuff like that. But
So this was drastic.
yes, this was quite a thing for a young fellow to do.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the living conditions. How did you stay in touch with your family?
Mail was a big thing. That was really our lifeline to home. So I would write usually every day, try to get mail out. Our mail went out on the, I didn't tell you this, that while we were on patrol in Vietnam, all our fuel came from oilers, the Navy oilers that would come out. They were these big tankers, and they would come alongside and send the fuel hoses over, and we would conduct what you call a high line. Sometimes they would send supplies over on a high line, kind of like a clothesline between the two ships, while we were taking on fuel and mail. We would send our mail back, and they would bring our mail out to us. And
How often would you get mail?
We would probably fuel twice a week, so our mail would go out and be received about twice a week. Also, all our supplies, all our food, and any materials that we would need for maintenance would also come out on store ships and be brought over to us by helicopter. They would also bring our mail out and take our mail. And also all our ammunition that we would use, our 5-inch gun, that would also be brought out on ammunition supply ships. And they would also bring our mail out, and we would send our mail with them. So there was this constant resupply being done by the Navy and their resupply efforts. So that's how our mail would go back and forth.
So then your mail, even though you were out at sea, was pretty consistent.
Yep. Like I said, about twice a week we would get our mail and send our mail home.
What was the food like?
Food was good for the most part. The cooks would not get a lot of fresh stuff. I think a lot of the stuff that appeared to be fresh, like the eggs. I can remember that they would, if they were making something with eggs, they would crack 5 at a time, and if they looked good, then they would put them into the mix. Because every once in a while you'd get a bad egg, and you didn't want to waste too many, so you'd do it like that. Because if you did them all at once, and then the last egg you put in was a bad egg, then they would all have to be thrown out. So we did seem to get fresh fruit. That was something that was kind of surprising. And we had a bakery on board. We would bake all our own breads and pastries and things like that. So the food, for the most part, on the Coast Guard cutter, on the big white ones, was pretty good. Actually,
now, was there like a regular dining hall that you would go to for 3 meals?
Yeah, that was called our mess deck, and they served breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Now, when you were back at Subic Bay, where did you eat? They had a regular dining room?
They had dining facilities there, but the ship, even though we were in port, we would still serve.
On your own ship?
Yeah, yeah. Part of the duties of a seaman was actually to serve as a mess cook, and that was usually for a month.
Did you do that?
I did it and liked it so much that I volunteered to do it 2-3 times, and then finally the skipper says, "Look, you gotta let somebody else have a chance of doing this." So.
Why, was that a fun duty to get?
Yeah, I liked it. You ate good, and you didn't have to chip paint and clean, so it was almost like the lesser of the evils.
So did you learn how to cook?
A little bit, and that's what I wanted to be when I went in the Coast Guard. My dad was a cook in the Army, and he says, listen, you want to be the most popular guy on the ship, be the cook. So it made a lot of sense to me, and it was true. I mean, the cooks were
popular guys.
They were pretty popular, yep.
Did you have plenty of supplies, plenty of food?
For the most part, I can't say that we lacked for anything.
What about things like ammunition and clothing?
We were well supplied. Clothing and stuff like that, pretty much when we were in Subic Bay, that was a U.S. Navy base, so they would have everything that we would possibly need there. If we needed some new uniforms or stuff like that, we would.
Did the Navy carry Coast Guard uniforms?
The Navy uniform and the Coast Guard were identical back then, with the exception of a shield that was on your sleeve, and that denoted you as a Coast Guardsman.
How did you get along with the Navy guys?
Fairly well. There was a little bit of rivalry there. I think for the most part we got along better with the Marines than we did with the Navy, only because of the rivalry. And during World War II, during the battle for Guadalcanal, Douglas Monroe, he was a coxswain on a Higgins boat. He was a Coast Guardsman serving in World War II. He received the Medal of Honor, saving some Marines. So the Marines had a lot of respect for the Coast Guardsmen because of that.
Now, at Subic Bay, who was stationed there? Marines, Navy, and Coast Guard?
Yeah, in the Philippines there, that was quite a big base, Subic. It was probably the biggest Navy base we had overseas.
They didn't have Army and Air Force there as well, did they?
There was an Air Force base at called Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, but Subic Bay was mostly a Navy and Marines. That's where all the oilers and all the stores ships and the ammunition ships and stuff like that, they were all coming, for the most part, out of Subic.
Did you feel any pressure or stress?
Like I said, the days were long. We were constantly doing something. while patrolling off the coast of Vietnam. I mean, when we weren't doing junk inspections, we were receiving fuel. When we weren't receiving fuel, we were receiving stores. If it wasn't stores, it was ammo. So there was this constant, everyday activities that was almost 24/7. These things could take place at any time, day or night. A lot of our naval gunfire was in the middle of the night. You'd hear the general quarters alarms go off. Usually the clue that something was going on was when you heard the jet engines start up. Usually we would steam along on the diesels, but once you heard those jets come online, then you knew that we were heading someplace quick.
Was that stressful when you were inspecting those junks and when you were called to general quarters?
Pretty much, because you never knew what to expect, what was going to happen. So, and it was hard. It was tough work. Our old 5-inch gun was all manually operated, so all the shells were all carried by hand, pretty much, and put in hoists and sent up to the gun and loaded by hand, and quite an operation.
Was there anything that you did special for good luck?
The only thing that really stands out is I wore a St. Christopher's medal that my parents had given me.
You still have it?
I'm not sure where that went. I wish I did have it, but like any young person in the service, that when you get out, that was a really highlight in your life, was put that behind you and kind of get on with things. It's only later in life that you really realize the importance of who you are, where you went, what you did. So,
but fortunately, you did save a lot of pictures and stuff from that period.
Yeah, I saved a lot of stuff, and I'm a pack rat like my mom was.
So with your record, we'll include the photographs that you have. How did people entertain themselves? Well, it sounds like you had more liberty than a lot of the other guys over in Vietnam, and you got to visit places. What other forms of entertainment did you have?
Well, during our patrols, we would have 1 or 2 movies every night.
On board ship?
On board ship, and the movies would usually come and go with the mail. They would try to get the latest and greatest movie releases, so that was pretty cool. And they would also have some TV serials like The Big Valley and some stuff like that every once in a while. A lot of spaghetti westerns and movies like that, stuff the guys would like. We would do every once in a while we would form a morale committee, and the morale committee would have things like bingo night, casino night, and things like that, where you could we all kind of get together on the mess deck and do things, and they set up like some gambling, things like that. And lots of times we would be doing that to raise money that we would use during our med caps. Almost all the cutters would adopt a village, and we'd buy paint and maybe paint one of the school buildings or something like that, and try to help out the villages there.
Did your cutter adopt a village?
Yeah, we had a village. I can't tell you the name of it, but it was pretty much the same one that we would go do our med caps in. And actually, I think some of the stuff that we had on board, we had a lot of clothes and toys and things like that. And I think that before the ship left Boston, a lot of the officers' wives, they had like the different clubs and stuff like that. They would run these collection things, and they would collect clothes and toys and stuff like that, and we would distribute those to the villages.
Did you see any USO shows?
No, I didn't participate in a USO show. although they were there, we knew of them, but you had to be in a particular, the right place at the right time, so to speak.
And that never meshed up with your schedule. Did you see any entertainers? Did any come aboard your cutter?
Nope, we weren't fortunate enough to have that. Although some of the other cutters did during the course of the war. I've seen some pictures of the cutter Rush. Actually, a USO show was right there, probably in Subic Bay, and they actually involved the ship in part of the show, so I've seen some pictures of that. But it was kind of the luck of the draw for that.
Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events?
I think on the ship, some of the things we used to do for fun was, especially the young guys, we'd play hide and seek and things like that, just for something to do. It can get boring at times on a boat, especially if there isn't any action going on.
Well, that's a pretty big boat too to play hide and go seek.
Well, there's plenty of places to hide, that's for sure. But the young guys would do things like that.
Did you pull pranks on each other?
Yeah, there was lots of pranks. Lots of hiding things and things like that.
All right, Chris, what did you think of the officers and of your fellow sailors?
Well, on the cutter chase, our crew was about 175. Officers were
175 sailors?
175 sailors. Officers were probably maybe 30 or 35 of those. Because we were such a small group, we were almost more like a family. Everybody knew everybody. We became quite close. Everybody seemed to get along pretty much. Of course, officers were always a pain in the butt, but they probably thought that us enlisted men were too. But we all seemed to get along well. Had a lot of respect for our captain and the officers that were in charge.
Who was your captain?
Captain Wayne Caldwell.
Did you form any close relationships? Made friends while you were on board?
Yes, like I said, we were like a family, and even to this day, we have reunions, and I keep in touch with probably 24 of my shipmates from back in those days. We have the Cutter Chase Association. I also belong to the Coast Guard Combat Veterans Association. So through those groups that we're all members, we keep in touch, and we get together and meet when we can.
How often do you have reunions?
We try to get together at least once a year.
Oh, wow, so that's quite frequent. Is it always in someplace different, or do you always go to the same place?
We try to have it someplace different. This has just started up recently, so like I said, when you're young, it doesn't seem to be as important. When you get older and start to think back, and you kind of rekindle those old friendships, and it's just a wonderful thing. It's almost like having your family back again.
Wow. Now, I know that you became a radar man before you left Vietnam. When did that happen, and how?
Well, I became, like I said before, I wanted to be a cook, but having spent some time on a ship and seeing all the different things that you could become, the radar men, they seemed to be where the action was. Where they worked was called the Combat Information Center, or like we used to call it, CIC. It was really the kind of the brains of the ship. A lot of the communication was done there in conjunction with the radio operators and things like that. So what I did was after I made seaman, I asked the captain if I could enter the striker program, which means that you could actually go and work with the radarmen and they call it striking your rate. So what you would do is you would apply for the school, and then go ahead and, with the captain's permission, go ahead and actually work with the radarman and get some on-the-job training before you went to class. So I put in for that. The captain approved it, and even while we were over in Vietnam during the tail end of the cruise, that's why I ended up working with the radarmen up in CIC.
So you actually, were you a radar man at that point?
Not officially. I was called what you call a striker. I was a radarman striker, but I was a seaman.
Oh, so it doesn't increase your rank?
No.
When you became an official radar man, did that increase your rank?
Yeah, after we had gotten back from Vietnam, I was waiting for a slot for the school to open up, and that was probably a couple months after we had gotten back. I went to Governor's Island, New York, and that's where the radarman school was, and attended school there. That was a 16-week course. And because I had already made seaman, when I graduated from radarman school, I graduated as a petty officer 3rd class, which is an E4, and with the official title as a radarman.
Yeah. Now, in the Coast Guard, can you choose what job you want to be trained for?
Yeah, pretty much. When you go to boot camp, you fill out, it's called a wish list, and you fill out the school that you would want to be trained in. I chose a cook, but that was a pretty popular school, tough to get in.
So radar man was second choice?
But like I said, having served on a ship and seeing the different jobs that were available, radar men seemed to be something that I really like doing. So.
Right, now when your tour was over in Vietnam, do you remember when you left Vietnam to come home?
I believe that was May 28th, 1970.
And what was your trip like coming back home, and where did you go?
On the way home, we made basically the same stops that we made on the way over for fuel. We stopped at Guam, 5 days in Hawaii, through the Panama Canal, and then home. And of course, we were excited.
Did you land in Baltimore?
No, Baltimore is where the Coast Guard yard is, and that's where the Coast Guard fleet does its maintenance. No, we went back to Boston. We arrived on the 3rd of July. We entered the harbor with the fireboats, sending red, white, and blue water up. Coast Guard helicopters escorted us into the harbor. And as we docked at Coast Guard Base Boston, we were greeted by Miss Massachusetts, and of course all our family and friends were waiting on the dock for us, and it was quite a welcome home. There was a whole armada of people in their pleasure boats that were alongside us and bringing us in, and I remember that there was some people on those boats were throwing beers up on deck, and it was just a wonderful homecoming.
Wow. All right, now, when you enlisted in the Coast Guard, how long do you enlist for?
Your typical enlistment was 4 years.
All right, so now you've done a year in Vietnam, and you've returned home, so you still have some years of service. What did you do after? Did you get any leave when you first got back?
Yeah, I had accumulated about 30 days, so I took my 30 days leave.
And from your 30 days leave is when you went to Governor's Island for your training?
No, went back to Boston. From there, we resumed our primary duties as a ocean station vessel. And that's, the Coast Guard cutters would go out and spend about 30 days out in the middle of the Atlantic in 3 or 4 different areas. Ocean Station Bravo, Charlie, Delta, or Echo. They were a 210 square mile area that was a known position in the ocean. And what we would do is we would work shipping and air traffic, and also search and rescue if that was necessary.
Did you have any incidents while you were on that duty?
There was at one time I think, I'm not sure if this was the Chase or the Campbell that I was on, but one of the balloon crossings, around the world crossings, was attempted, and that balloon went down, and we were part of the search and rescue for that. But we didn't find anything.
Now, when did you change from the Chase to the Campbell?
Well, after doing a couple ocean stations, after coming back from Vietnam, I was finally notified that actually we went to on the last ocean station that we were on, prior to going to radarman school, we encountered some bad weather out on our station, which I believe it was Ocean Station Delta, to the point where the seas were so rough, like in the Perfect Storm movie, 30, 40-foot seas, 50-foot seas, that we started to our ship started to break in half.
And this is still the Cutter Chase?
This is the Cutter Chase, where the aluminum superstructure was. That particular class of ship was made without expansion joints, and right where an expansion joint should have been, the ship started to break up. The waves were crashing over our decks. It was releasing the life rafts and things like that. The captain actually had us all put our life jackets on. It was pretty intense. So after going through that storm, instead of going back to Boston, we went right to the Coast Guard Yard in Baltimore, went dry dock, and to put the ship back together again. That was pretty scary. But while we were in Baltimore, that's when I received my orders to go to radarman school. My opening had finally gotten there. So I said goodbye to my shipmates and went to Governor's Island, New York for my 16 weeks of training.
What was that like?
That was pretty neat. That was Governor's Island, of course, is an island right off of Manhattan. So I was literally stationed in New York City for 16 weeks and got to go and have some fun in New York City. But,
well, was there a Coast Guard base there, or were you in civilian housing?
no, Coast Guard. The Governor's Island was a Coast Guard base.
Oh, so they had barracks right there?
Yeah, it was a huge base. A lot of the Coast Guard schools were there.
Is it really an island off of New York?
Yeah, it's a big island, right off the tip of Manhattan.
So what were your typical days like? Classroom during the day and then free at night?
Yeah, pretty much. And there was plenty to do right on the island. I mean, everything that you would want was right there. They had swimming pools and bowling alleys and theaters, and they had the enlisted men's club, which is where you could go get a cold beer, and actually they had a place where they would have dances out there. They would have bands play and stuff like that. And then of course you could take the ferry and go to Manhattan.
So now, was this in 1970?
No, I believe I started school in 1971, in April of 71.
After your 16 weeks at Governor's Island, what did you do?
I was assigned to the Cutter Campbell out of Portland, Maine. She was an old 327-foot secretary class cutter. Those cutters were built and commissioned back in the 1930s.
So this must have been older than the Cutter Chase.
Yeah, it was an old girl, like we used to call her.
Was it a lot different?
Yes, very much different. tighter quarters. Although during the years they would try to modernize them and keep them up, but still it was an old ship, and as such it was a lot smaller than the Cutter Chase. Wasn't air conditioned inside and things like that. A lot of the compartments were smaller. CIC was pretty small.
Now, you're an officer by this point, correct?
A petty officer, not a commissioned officer.
So at least now you can't be cleaning and painting. You've moved up to chain.
Exactly. I had gotten my crow, and that's you get a patch that goes on your sleeve, and it has one red chevron for third-class petty officer, and it has an eagle on it, and then a designator for your rate, which was my radarman, which was a round circle with a kind of an arrow going through it. And so I was stand radar watches, and actually had some of the seamen and radarmen strikers that would actually work under me at that point.
And how long did you serve on the Campbell?
Campbell was, I think I served about 6 months on her prior to getting out.
So that was your last duty station?
Yeah.
And where would you still in the Atlantic?
Yeah, during my time on the Campbell was primarily ocean station duty and or search and rescue.
Do you recall your last day in service?
My last day was the Campbell had gone down to Baltimore for some yard maintenance, and I was discharged there. Probably one of the happiest days of my life.
Do you recall the date?
August 24th, 1972.
So you were discharged in Baltimore. Does the Coast Guard get you home, or do you have to find your own way home?
No, they'd get you home.
So you came back to Connecticut?
Yeah, flew home. And
what did you do in the days and weeks right after your discharge?
Well, looking for a job. My parents had moved to Florida, so they were in Florida, and my sister was still in Connecticut, so I lived with her, and then found a job working. And
Where did you work?
I got a job working in a clothing store, Regal's Men's Shop. And very shortly thereafter had met my wife Shawnee. She was working in the shoe store next door, and we had kind of known each other from high school, and so we kind of hooked up together and had a short courting of about a month. Got an apartment together, and a few weeks after that got married.
What was the date?
December 1st, 1972.
Did you go back to school at all?
I used my GI Bill, took a couple courses at Manchester Community College. That didn't seem like something that I wanted to do. I decided to use my GI Bill to go to auto body school.
Where'd you go?
It was I can't remember the name of the school, but it was in Hartford, and I worked it was an apprentice program, a dealership that was in Ellington. It was called Mickey's Rambler, I believe, or Mickey's Motors.
So did you make your career then at auto body work?
No, I didn't stay with that either. I did complete the course and everything, but his shop ended up folding, the auto body part of it. So I decided not to pursue that because that was very, very unhealthy, and used to get sick all the time from the fumes and stuff like that. So did a little bit of work in the working on tractor trailer rebuilding trailers and things like that. It was pretty much sheet metal and things like that. Not the auto body type stuff with chemicals and paint and things.
More mechanical?
Yeah, yeah.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Of course, that was Vietnam, and that was a lot of controversy in that. The things that we did there, that the Coast Guard did there, I mean, we were participating in the war, which, as a young guy, you really don't think much about it at the time, but to look back on it now, as an adult, I think war is probably one of the most foolish, stupid things that we do as human beings. I hope and pray someday that we can get beyond that, and instead of shoot each other, talk to each other, talk things out.
How did your military service affect your life?
I think my time in the Coast Guard really helped me to mature, become a man, so to speak. I had a good set of values by the way I was raised, but that also gave me a good set of values, good work ethics, how to get along with people, how to do things that you don't want to do because they have to be done, and you're the person that has to do them. And I think for the most part it was probably a good experience.
Is there anything else that you can recall that you'd like to share that we haven't covered so far in this interview?
Just that I'm very, very proud of my service with the Coast Guard, especially in Vietnam. It's a story that not too many people know. I'm one of only 8,000 Coast Guardsmen that served in Vietnam during the course of the war. The Coast Guard was involved in things that people really didn't realize. We were involved in the explosives loading, all the bombs and artillery and stuff like that was brought into Vietnam. Before the Coast Guard got involved in it, it was just haphazardly brought in and offloaded. They saw the potential there for disaster, so the Coast Guard was asked to come in and set up a explosive loading detachment and really get control on the safe handling of that. The Coast Guard was brought in to set up a whole navigation system, which is the Loran system.
Lorant?
Yeah. And that was providing navigation to the all the planes and shipping and stuff to bring in all the men and materials. Vietnam didn't really have aids to navigation like buoys and things like that set up in their harbors. They had basically what was left over from the French when the French were there. So the Coast Guard was asked to come in and set that whole navigation system up, which they did. Sent some buoy tenders over and set up all the buoys and all the navigation in the harbors and along the coasts. Yeah, there was many things that the Coast Guard did there that we're very proud of. I guess that's probably about it.
Was there any other memorable experiences that you'd like to add?
Just that it's just quite an experience to serve with another group of men, that you depend on each other. You form bonds that are lifelong bonds. Very rewarding experience, I think, that serving in the military like that.
Well, Chris, I'd like to thank you for your interview, and I'd like to thank you for your service for our country.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this.